So good to be with you this morning and opportunity to just continue in the sermon series that we have been in over the last several weeks. I'm not sure if you've heard of the book, The Power of Habit. Have any of you here ever heard of the book, The Power of Habit? Anybody here? A couple people? If you were here last service, probably. No, kidding. The Power of Habit, it was written by a man named Charles Duhigg. In this book, he presents the concept of keystone habits. A keystone habit is a habit that when it is present in your life, it affects other areas of your life that aren't necessarily directly associated with it. So, for example, if you make your bed in the morning, studies have shown that you have a more productive day. Now, making your bed is a keystone habit because it affects things that have nothing to do with that particular habit. So you're more likely to respond to email and stay on task. Making your bed is not directly connected to that. However, when you start your day with that activity, this keystone habit, it affects other areas of your life. Exercise is the same way. Studies have shown that if you exercise regularly, at least once a week, that you will use your credit cards less. Why is that? We don't know, but they are associated, that this particular habit, when it is present in your life, it affects other areas of your life. And that's something a concept I'll represent to you periodically because it is such a critical concept to understand with our lives. Another study shows that if children are read to at the age of 5, and then by the age of 10, the parents are still engaged with their academic progress, they care about how they're doing in school, then those children are much less likely to end up in poverty. Now, how does reading to your child at 5 have anything to do with the income that they'll make later on in life? I have no idea. Nobody does, but it's still there because it's a keystone habit. And while that is interesting information, and it does help us to live our lives better in this world, what I want to talk to you about, or what we have been talking about over these last few weeks, are the habits that when they're present in your life, they help you to have a stronger relationship with God. They help you to become more like Jesus. And so 2 weeks ago, Gene Barron talked to us about the importance of reading your Bible and reflecting on Scripture. Last week, Brandon Burcham did a great job of talking to us about the importance of prayer. And these are spiritual disciplines. Brandon asked the question of us, how many of us here have ever had an experience or a moment in time in which we felt stalled in our faith, stuck? He asked us that question. How many of you here have ever felt like that? I'll ask you again. Yeah, nearly everyone in this room has had a moment where they felt stuck in their faith. Now, you don't have to answer this question. I would rather you just reflect upon it, but are you stuck right now? Are you stalled in your faith? There was a study that was done over 17,500 people about those who were stalled in their faith and somehow they became unstalled in their faith. And this chart I have here shares that information with you. That of those who were stalled in their faith, 62% of them were able to become unstalled by having spiritual disciplines present in their life. We might call them keystone spiritual disciplines. When these are present in your life, then they will affect the rest of your spirituality, the rest of your relationship with God. And so that's why we had a sermon on how to read your Bible and why that is important. That's why we had a sermon on prayer, because it's so significant in our relationship with God. And then today we're going to have another sermon on another spiritual habit that needs to be present in our lives. But it's a habit that many of us, perhaps you, have not even heard a sermon on before. Maybe if you have heard a sermon, it was long ago. It's what I have found one of the topics that rarely gets talked about in churches, rarely gets studied by people. I had a young lady come up to me after the service and she said, after this past service, and she said, I went to Bible college and I've never heard a sermon on this topic. And so today we're going to talk about fasting. Yeah, don't everybody celebrate at once. Fasting. Now, naturally, our minds go to thinking of food, and that's very appropriate because generally fasting is associated with food. But it also goes beyond that. I would like to present to you today that it's much more than that. In fact, as you're considering the questions, what is it that controls you? What is it that influences you in your life? What is it that perhaps is a barrier between God and you having a stronger relationship? It doesn't necessarily have to be sinful per se, but it just has more influence over you than you would like. It's something that you struggle to say no to. that will be the thing that you need to hone in on and probably fast upon. For example, about 8 o'clock at night, I have the struggle of wanting to eat a bowl of cereal. Now, is a bowl of cereal bad? No, it's good. It's really good. It's so good. It's a terrible habit, though. It's not good for me. But in that moment, if that desire is so intense or strong that I can't say no to it, then that is something that I need to be removing from my life, or at least I need to regain control of it, because it's in that instance that we realize that that is inhibiting my relationship with God, because the thing that controls you will be the thing that you are devoted to, and what you are devoted to will become what you worship, and we can go on and on and on like that. And it may seem like we're making a lot of a little thing here, but why is it that Jesus and the rest of the scriptures will make such a big deal about fasting? Because it's often these little things in our lives that can grow and control us. The main idea for today is simply this, is fasting regulates anything in our lives that could have more influence on us than God. Fasting regulates, it doesn't have to eliminate, regulates anything in our lives that could have more influence on us than God. And so why should we fast? How should we fast? When should we fast? How long should we fast? I'm going to share with you what the scriptures have to say about this subject that I believe is incredibly important. I led a discipleship group a few years ago, and it lasted for a year, and I had about 15 or 16 people go through the study, and we hit on a variety of different subjects, a variety of different spiritual disciplines that could be present in your life, all sorts of controversial issues. The two things that were the most impactful to the people in that class, one was evangelism. The second was fasting, because so few people do it. And so few of us know anything about it and what the Bible actually says of it. So the first point that we have to understand this about why you can fast is this, is you can fast because God expects you to. It's an expectation that he has. When Jesus shared the Sermon on the Mount, the most well-known sermon ever preached, there were three things in that sermon that he said, you will do, I will do. He said, you will pray. He said the exact words were, when you pray, because he expected us to pray. When you give, because he expected us to be generous. And then he said, when you fast, because he expected us to fast. These were his exact words. He said, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others that they are fasting. Jesus is focused on the motive here. What's interesting for me and us in this time is I'm really not that concerned about the motive, although I should be, because I just want us to do it. The challenge for us is just to do the fast, and then we deal with the motive after that. For Jesus, the challenge wasn't getting people to fast, it was the motive for why they fast, because they fasted to please man and not please God. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full, but when you fast, again, when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. In other words, don't look as though gaunt, you might say, or look like you haven't eaten for days, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. There was a time, though, when a fast was not expected. Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 9. John the Baptist's disciples went to him and they asked the question, why is it that your disciples don't fast? We fast, we're spiritual. The Pharisees fast, they're very spiritual, they're very religious. Why is it that your disciples don't fast? And this was Jesus' response. Then John's disciples came and asked him, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus answered, how can the guest of the bridegroom mourn while he's with him? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. We've all been to a wedding, and when you go to a wedding, there's a ceremony, and then there's a reception. At the reception, you eat the meal that has been provided for you. Often it's a meat, it's some type of a potato, maybe it's a vegetable, a fruit. You drink whatever drink is provided for you. You eat as much cake as your doctor will let you. But then there comes a point when the reception ends. The bride leaves, the groom leaves. It would be kind of silly to remain there and continue to eat after they left. Jesus is telling us that the groom has left. And so now it is very appropriate for us to have times in which we do not eat, in which we fast. However, there will come a time, as Revelation 19 tells us, in which we will have to fast no longer. Don alluded to this in his communion meditation. Luke 22 tells us that Jesus right now actually is fasting for us. He says, until my kingdom comes, until that day arrives, that I am fasting for you. But in Revelation 19, as Revelation 19 tells us, there will come a day when there will be a great feast. It's called the Lamb's Supper. And we will all get to partake of it, and we will never have to fast again. But until the day comes that the groom returns, we are expected to fast. The second point that we learn from the scriptures is this, is that you can fast in a variety of ways. The Bible doesn't simply stipulate or regulate that it needs to be one particular way that we fast. There are numerous ways that we can fast. I know that as I've thought about fasting, there have been a few different occasions in which I've fasted from caffeine. And there have been times when I have fasted for 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours or days, because there's a variety of ways to do it. And then sometimes it's eliminating things, sometimes it's eliminating something, sometimes it's eliminating everything. The Bible tells us that there is first a regular fast. A regular fast. A regular fast is in which you still drink liquids, but you eliminate food from your body. That's what you eliminate food from being partaked into your body. That's what Jesus did in the wilderness. In Matthew chapter 4, this is what the text says. See, often people think that for 40 days Jesus did not drink water, but that's not what the scripture says at all. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, it says, after fasting, and this is one of my favorite verses ever, 40 days and 40 nights he was hungry. I mean, like they needed to put that explanation in there. Obviously, the man was hungry. He was starving. But it doesn't say anything about him not drinking water. And whether he received that water supernaturally through a rock or naturally through a stream, we do not know. But Jesus did participate in what is known as a regular fast. There's also what's called a partial fast. In Daniel, in the book of Daniel, we find that there were instances in which Daniel ate, but he did not eat of other foods. In Daniel chapter 1, he is being pressured to eat of food that would have compromised him, the king's choice food. And so he doesn't eat of the king's food or drink of the king's wine. Instead, he says this to the guard, the chief official. He said, please test your servants for 10 days. He says, we can't eat this. It will compromise our faith. Instead, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. That's what's known as a Daniel fast. And so he's drinking water, he's eating vegetables, but there's no meats and there's other foods that are not a part of, no fruits and other foods that are not a part of this particular meal. And then on the backside of that, they actually came out looking better and being stronger than the others who did eat of the king's food. There's also what's known as a full fast, and that's where you eat nothing and then you drink nothing. And this is one that I would recommend to you with caution, that you shouldn't do it without some type of medical supervision. But that's what the Apostle Paul did in Acts chapter 9. You see, Paul, as you know, some of you know, but maybe if you don't, he had this great zeal for God. He was incredibly committed to God's law, and he was against Christians. And so he imprisoned them. He persecuted them. But on the way to Damascus, to continue what it is that he had been doing, Jesus meets him there. He blinds him. And he tells Paul that your zeal for God is misplaced. And this is something that rocks his world. And it shattered him to the point that he had to go 3 days and 3 nights without eating anything. Acts chapter 9, verse 9 says, for 3 days he was blind and did not drink anything. Because it was for those 3 days that he had to reassess who he was, and he had to understand better what it was that God was trying to communicate to him. Because Paul's zeal was placed to God, but the way that it was functioning in his life was terrible, and it was wrong. And so he went 3 days without eating or drinking. There's another fast in the Bible that goes beyond, the Bible specifically mentions, that goes beyond food, and that's what's called a sexual fast. And all the married men said, no. But Paul does mention it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 3 in reading. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. In other words, what you do doesn't just impact you. It doesn't just affect you. It affects who it is that you're married to as well, male or female. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent. And so there's this mutual consent and for prayer. And so you're seeking God in this season in which there is this break in this sexual activity. Then come back together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In other words, what he's saying is you can do this to draw closer to God, but don't do it so long that it actually pushes you away from God, because sin begins to drift into your life because of temptation. Now, there's another type of fast that isn't in the scriptures, but as John Ortberg says, he believes that if Jesus were with us today, that Jesus would teach this, and that's what I would say is a technology fast. Because we are just consumed by the electronics in our lives. And so John Ortberg argues in his book, The Life That You've Always Wanted, that Jesus wouldn't be so focused on us having an empty refrigerator, but instead an unplugged home. And so over the past few weeks, I've gone a couple of days without looking at social media. And through the course of that process, I realized, wow, this is really distracting me. This is taking up quite a bit of my time. This isn't helping me to be more effective with my life. And so maybe for you, you need to remove Facebook, or you need to remove Instagram, or you need to not look at Netflix or Hulu one night. There was a study that was done on the Amish, with an Amish research that was done with an Amish group in Pennsylvania over the course of several decades. One of the key characteristics of the Amish that distinguished them from the rest of America was their lack of depression. Now, isn't that interesting? That often we run to technology to relax, to escape from the worries of this world, the things that cause us to be depressed. And here are these people who absolutely disdain technology. They have nothing to do with it for the most part. And they're the least depressed amongst us. And so maybe this week you need to go a day in your home without turning on an iPad, without turning on the television, without looking, God forbid, your phone. Go a day without checking your email, looking at your watch, whatever it may be. Just unplug and see what it is that God can do with that. And so there are a variety of ways to fast. But what is it that we should fast for? What is it perhaps that it can even prompt us to fast? One thing that we see exemplified in the Bible is that we can fast for God's intervention. I've talked with enough of you to know that you want that. You want God to intervene in your financial situation, your job situation, your health situation, your marital situation, your relationship with your children. You're wanting God's supernatural intervention into these particular things. In the Bible, one of the things that prompted people to fast was those moments when they wanted God to intervene. This was especially true in the book of Esther. There was an edict that was sent out. All of the Israelites would be executed. Esther was their only hope because she was the queen of this kingdom. And so her cousin Mordecai sends her a note, and he says, you have to go to the king and get him to rescind this particular command that he has put out. And Esther responds and says, you know that I can't do that. If I go to the king without being summoned, he will take my life. Mordecai responds back and says, Esther, if you don't do this, do not think that you too will not be found out, and that you will not perish, and that the rest of us will not perish. But who knows but that you have been put here for such a time as this. And so does she just go then and walk right into the king's chamber? Does she kneel down and just say a simple little prayer? No. The text says this in Esther chapter 4, verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all of the Jews who are in Susa and have them fast for me. And the Bible also seems to teach us that there's power when multiple people fast for a particular issue. for a particular thing that they want God to intervene in. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And so Esther would then go to the king after those 3 days, and the king would indeed rescind this particular proclamation that he had sent out, and all of the Israelites would ultimately live because of that, because there was this divine intervention that seemingly took place in this particular moment. And so what if when you needed that type of intervention, when you needed God to move on your behalf, like you were at your wit's end, you couldn't do anything else about your particular situation. What if in that moment you decided to fast? What if when you had a significant conflict with your husband or your wife, that instead of trying to argue it out for several days or not speaking with him or her for several days, you took some time to fast and ask for God's intervention? What if when you lost sleep because of one of your children, instead of you continuing to lose sleep because of them, you took a day to fast and to ask God to intervene in that situation? What if when you were so angry at your boss that you could hardly function anymore at your work, rather than allowing that frustration to build up and ultimately boil over, instead of just allowing that to happen, you just took a day and asked God to intervene in that situation in a way that you could not? See, some of us here, we'll say, well, why should I do stuff like that? Why should I pray? Why should I fast? Because isn't God just going to do what God's going to do anyway? God doesn't change. And you're right, God doesn't change. But catch this. When we add something to the situation, God may not change, but the situation changes. So let me illustrate it for you this way. You want a job. So you fill out applications, submit your resume, go to the interviews, hopefully get an offer. Fill out the applications, submit the resumes, go to the interviews, you don't get a job. That's the equation. Okay? So why pray about it? God doesn't change. But here's what we don't realize. Fill out the applications, submit the resume, do the interviews, pray, fast. The two are always connected. Fasting without prayer is just a diet. just to put that out there. Pray, fast, then you get the job. I'm not saying that'll always happen. Did God change? No. The situation changed. And that's why you see in the Bible these instances in which people prayed, like specifically Moses prayed, and God even told Moses, don't pray anymore. I don't want you praying. Just don't pray for him, because if you pray, the situation's going to change, and then I'm going to have to relent. And that's exactly what Moses did. He prayed for the Israelites, and God relented. God didn't change. The situation changed. And they pleaded for God to intervene into that situation. And so we fast for God's intervention. Another thing that you can fast for is guidance with important decisions that you have to make. Because some of you are wondering, should you take the job, a new job? Should you stay at your job? Should you buy a house? Should you sell a house? Should you marry him? Should you marry her? Do you need to break up with your boyfriend, break up with your girlfriend? Some of you are wondering, should we do in vitro fertilization? Should we have another child? You have big decisions that you're making. When Paul planted churches, one of the biggest decisions that he had to make was who would be the leaders in that church once he left. They're called elders. And so did he just look across the crowd of people and say, well, you are strong emotionally, so you can be an elder, and you seem like you know more scripture than everybody else, so you can be an elder, and you're really good with people, so you can be an elder. Maybe those were factors. But we also find here in the book of Acts, chapter 14, verse 23, that one of Paul's practices, specifically here in Antioch, was this: Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church with prayer and fasting, committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. And so fasting is something that can help us with very important decisions. fasting can also make your prayers more effective. I think one of the great examples of this is in the book of Ezra, that Ezra goes to the king there and he requests the king to be able to go back and repopulate Jerusalem. Now Ezra is a bit embarrassed because it's a rather dangerous trip, and the text actually will tell us that he was ashamed because he knew it was a dangerous trip, and he was ashamed because if he asked for military escort to go back to Jerusalem, then he would show the king that he was putting more faith in the king than he was in God. And so he doesn't request the soldiers to go with them. But that's an instance in which he really needed God to intervene. He needed God to work on his behalf. He needed his prayer to be more effective. He needed to add a little bit more to that equation that we were just talking about. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, going back to Jerusalem, remaining safe, and he answered our prayer. Perhaps one of the reasons why your prayers haven't been as effective as they could be is that you haven't incorporated fasting with them. In the Olympics, there's a high jump. And you're familiar with the high jump, but they generally jump about 7 feet in height. And the athlete will come up to this bar and he will fling his body over the bar with all the effort that he has, generally to about 7 feet. There's also another high jump that takes place in the Olympics, and it's called the pole vault. And the athlete will stand at the end of the runway, take off towards where this high bar is, generally about 18 feet in height. And he will slam the pole into the ground, put all of his weight and trust into that pole, and the pole will fling him over the top of that bar, a height of which no traditional high jumper could ever imagine reaching. What made the difference? The pole. He was able to go to heights that he otherwise wouldn't have been able to. What I want to propose to you is that's what fasting can do with your prayers. That you can pray and pray and pray and pray, and you'll hit certain heights, and you'll see God function in certain ways, but it's when we can add that extra element to it that it seems like then that we can go to heights that we would otherwise never be able to go to before, because we're straining and we're praying for the mountain to get over top of the mountain in front of us. But maybe when we fast, though, it's in that moment that we can remember that we don't have to work to get over the mountain on our own. Instead, we can just trust God to move the mountain in front of us. When we have a financial issue, we're in some type of financial crisis, and we're trying to figure out how it is that we're going to get through it. It's in those moments of fasting that perhaps we can be reminded that God owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. It's when we fast that maybe we can be reminded that somebody in our lives that we love, that our heart breaks for, and they're so far from God, we have no idea of knowing how they'll ever find their way back to God. It's then that we remember that Jesus said, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. It's when you're battling an illness that you think that you'll take your life, that you think will take your life. It's maybe in the midst of the fast that you realize that God is the one who actually gives life. Fasting makes prayer more effective. It adds an element to that equation that wouldn't be there otherwise. Another reason that people fast in the scriptures is remorse over sin. In the book of 1 Samuel, the Israelites there have been struggling with idol worship for some 20 years. And then finally, they're ready to turn their lives around. Finally, they're ready to be committed to God. So do they just do that? They just commit to God? What do they do about all the sins and all the idol worship they've had? Verse 6 says this in 1 Samuel chapter 7. When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. And what you have to understand is fasting does not help us to be forgiven any more than Jesus already forgives us. But what fasting can do, and I've had many moments in my life where I've just fasted for a day and I've separated myself from some behavior or some action or something that I did that I shouldn't have done. And I just see it as a moment in which you're living one way, and that fast, it's like you're going to end. You're going to stop something right there, and it's no longer going to be a part of your life. And not just that particular thing, but even just the way that you normally function. And you do it for a season, whatever that time is that you decide, and then you pick up. And it's a new start. It's a new day. Jesus said you are a new person. And so we can fast over our remorse for sin. The last point, and this kind of goes without saying, but it needs to be said, is you can fast to strengthen your relationship with God. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a woman named Anna who seemed to have a special connection with God. The type of connection that many people wish that they could have with God. She had been in the temple worshiping and praying to God for many years of her life. Her husband had passed away. And this is what the text says in Luke 2 of a description of her worship. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple but worshiped night and day. And how do they describe the strong relationship that she had with God? With fasting and prayer. She removed everything else from her life that was perhaps a distraction for her and her focus upon the Lord. When Laura and I had just started dating, we had been together for a few months. We went to breakfast one morning. And when we were in breakfast, it was a Panera, and they had a stack of newspapers there at the checkout line. And I, after we had ordered our food, I looked back at Laura and I said, "Hey, would you mind if I bought a newspaper and read it while we ate breakfast?" If your eyes could strangle you, okay? And then I realized that she didn't understand the importance of reading your daily newspaper. And so I began to argue with her and explain to her, like, no, I can catch up on the news and the weather and what's happening with sports and other things that are going on in the world. And it's been too many years have passed for me to remember her exact words. But she basically said, "When you're with me, I want you to focus on me." And so what is this in your life that you need to remove, that you need to not pick up, that you need to say no to, that's keeping you from being focused on God? Whatever that thing is, what I want to challenge you with today is to say no to that this week. Whatever that impulse is that you struggle to say no to, and it's not necessarily, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it may be a good thing that's controlling you. What is it this week that you need to fast from, that you need to remove from your life? And maybe it's food, or maybe it's technology, or maybe it's a newspaper, or maybe it's something else. I don't know, but you do know. And whatever that thing is, what if instead of you focusing on that thing, you just removed it from your life and took that time and allowed your relationship with God to be stronger than it would otherwise be? You know what that thing is, and so my challenge for you this week is to remove that from your life. Let's have a prayer, and the team will continue to lead us in worship. Thank you, Father, for how your word speaks to us about this important subject. Help us, God, to apply it this week. Whatever the things are that we need to remove from our lives, help us to remove those things from our lives and to allow you to be truly the Lord of our life. In Jesus Christ's name.